line and calculating eyes that had first attracted her 5 years ago. But now those features seemed carved from ice. "I've been meaning to discuss this with you," he said, his tone suggesting he was announcing a quarterly report rather than ending their marriage. "My attorney advised serving you formally to avoid any confusion about timelines." Victoria's free hand instinctively moved to her rounded belly. 8 months pregnant, she felt vulnerable and exposed in her cotton nightgown, while he stood there fully dressed for another day of conquest in the tech world. "Your attorney," she repeated slowly. "Not our attorney. Yours." "Well, obviously we'll need separate representation now." James stepped carefully around the broken ceramic, his Armani shoes avoiding the spreading coffee stain. "I've already spoken with Mitchell and Associates about your settlement options. You'll be well provided for, naturally." The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of believing she'd found someone who loved her for herself rather than her family's money. And he was discussing her future like a business transaction. "When?" she asked. "When what? When did you decide? When did you decide our marriage was over?" James paused at the kitchen island, pouring himself orange juice from the crystal pitcher she'd given him for their second anniversary. "Victoria, let's be honest. We've both known this wasn't working for months. We want different things. You want some fairy tale life with white picket fences and family dinners. I need someone who understands my world, my ambitions. Someone like Amber Delacroix?" The name hung in the air between them like an accusation. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that her words had found their mark. "I don't know what you mean." "The receipts in your jacket pocket, the hotel charges on our credit card statement, the way you've been working late every night for the past 3 months. Victoria's voice remained steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. "I'm pregnant, James. Not stupid." He had the grace to look uncomfortable at least. "Amber understands the entertainment industry. She gets the networking, the public appearances, the pressure of building an empire. And I don't. You never did." The words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep. "You wanted me to be someone I'm not. Some suburban husband content with a middle-class life. That's not who I am, Victoria. That's not who I'll ever be." Victoria stared at the man she'd married, searching for any trace of the person who'd once held her hand during thunderstorms and brought her soup when she was sick. He was still there somewhere beneath the expensive clothes and corporate ambition, but he felt like a stranger now. "What about the baby?" "We'll work out custody arrangements. 50-50 split, supervised visits initially given your condition." He spoke as if their unborn child was another asset to be divided, like their cars or furniture. "My attorney assures me it's all very standard." Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach, a growing certainty that this conversation would be a turning point in ways James couldn't possibly imagine. She thought of the phone call she'd avoided making for 7 years, the number she'd memorized but never dialed. "Your condition," she repeated. "You mean my pregnancy." "I mean your obvious emotional instability, the mood swings, the paranoia about Amber, the way you've been isolating yourself from our friends." "Your friends, you mean? The ones who knew about your affair and said nothing to me?" James finished his orange juice and set the glass in the sink with deliberate care. "I have a breakfast meeting with investors in 30 minutes. My attorney will contact you about scheduling a settlement conference. I'll be staying at the Chateau Marmont for the next few days while you process this." He moved toward the hallway, then paused without turning around. "For what it's worth, Victoria, I did love you. But love isn't enough to build the kind of life I want. I need a partner who complements my success, not someone who's content hiding from the world." After he left, Victoria stood alone in the kitchen she'd designed with such hope 2 years ago. The morning light streaming through the windows felt harsh and unforgiving, highlighting every flaw in their carefully constructed life. She walked to the bedroom they'd shared for 3 years, each step feeling like a goodbye. On his nightstand, tucked beneath a business magazine, she found what she was looking for. A black lace thong that definitely wasn't hers, still carrying traces of perfume she didn't recognize. Attached was a note in feminine handwriting. "Thanks for the weekend, darling. Can't wait for our Cabo trip next month. All my love, A." Victoria felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest, sharp and bitter. While she'd been planning their nursery, James had been planning his escape with his 25-year-old actress girlfriend. She picked up her phone with steady hands and dialed the number she'd carried in her memory like a talisman for 7 years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Sterling Steel Industries, Margaret Sterling's office. Patricia, it's Victoria, she said quietly. I need to speak with my grandmother. Miss Victoria. Oh my goodness, we haven't heard from you in so long. Hold on, dear, I'll get her right away. The pause seemed to stretch forever, filled with the weight of years and decisions and a life she'd tried so hard to leave behind. When Margaret Sterling's voice came through the phone, strong and commanding even at 62, Victoria felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flag in the wind. Victoria Catherine Sterling, her grandmother said, and the sound of her full name spoken with such authority made her spine straighten automatically. It's been 7 years. I know, grandmother, I know it has. And now you're calling, which means something has happened. Victoria closed her eyes and felt her baby kick against her ribs, as if sensing the moment's importance. It's time, Margaret, she said simply. James Morrison has no idea he just declared war on the wrong family. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. I'll be on the next plane to Los Angeles, Margaret said finally. And Victoria? Yes? Welcome home, my dear. Welcome home. Amber Delacroix spun in front of her Beverly Hills apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows, her silk robe flowing around her like liquid gold. The morning sun caught the highlights in her carefully maintained blonde waves, and she felt beautiful and powerful and utterly victorious. At 25, she'd already learned that timing was everything in both Hollywood and love affairs. And today, finally, the timing was perfect. The divorce papers had been served. James had texted her from his car. It's done. Victoria knows. We can be together now. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the contacts until she found her agent's number. Richard, it's Amber. I have some news that's going to change everything. James Morrison is getting divorced. The tech millionaire? Amber, honey, this is perfect timing. I just got off the phone with Netflix about that romantic drama series. If you're dating Morrison, that's exactly the kind of high-profile relationship that could push you from supporting actress to leading lady territory. Amber smiled, admiring herself in the mirrored wall of her living room. Not dating, Richard. Marrying. Once the divorce is final, of course. Jesus, Amber. Do you know what Morrison's net worth is? We're talking about serious money here. Tech IPOs, investment portfolios, real estate holdings across 3 states. You could fund your own production company. The thought sent a thrill through her. She'd grown up in a trailer park in Bakersfield, fighting for every opportunity, every audition, every chance to prove she was more than just another pretty face with Hollywood dreams. James Morrison represented the culmination of every calculation she'd made, every relationship she'd strategically navigated. I know exactly what he's worth, she said, and I know exactly what I bring to the table. Beauty, youth, industry connections, and enough ambition to match his own. Her doorbell rang, and she practically floated to answer it. James stood in the hallway holding a Louis Vuitton shopping bag and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who just closed a major deal. Good morning, beautiful, he said, pulling her into his arms. How does it feel to be dating a soon-to-be divorced man? It feels like destiny, Amber replied, meaning every word. Inside the bag, she found a diamond tennis bracelet that probably cost more than most people's cars. The stones caught the light like captured stars, and she fastened it around her wrist with reverent fingers. James, it's gorgeous, but you didn't need to buy me anything. You're all I want. I want everyone to know you're mine now, he said, settling onto her white leather sofa. No more hiding, no more secret weekends. I want to take you to industry events, introduce you to my business partners, show you off the way you deserve. Amber curled up next to him, her head on his shoulder. What about Victoria? How did she take it? Better than expected, honestly. Very calm, very composed. I think she saw it coming. James's fingers traced patterns on Amber's bare arm. She'll be fine. Victoria's always been good at adapting to circumstances. And the baby? Something flickered across James's expression, too quickly for Amber to interpret. We'll work out custody arrangements. Every other weekend, holidays, summer vacations when the child is older. Very standard divorce stuff. Amber nodded, though privately she wondered how standard anything could be when it involved a newborn baby. Still, she pushed the thought aside. Victoria Sterling Morrison had chosen to play the role of suburban wife and mother. Amber was choosing to be a power couple with one of Los Angeles' most successful entrepreneurs. "I want to do this right," she said carefully. "I don't want anyone thinking I'm just some homewrecker who stole someone's husband. Maybe we should wait a few months before going public. Let the dust settle from the divorce." James pulled back to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "Amber, I've waited 36 years to find someone who really understands my vision. I'm not waiting any longer. Life is short, and opportunities don't last forever." She felt a flutter of unease at his words, though she couldn't pinpoint why. "Of course, you're right. I just want to make sure we handle everything perfectly. Trust me, sweetheart. I've built a $40 million company from nothing. I know how to handle complicated situations." $40 million. The number still took Amber's breath away. In Bakersfield, $40 million was lottery ticket money, fantasy money, money that existed only in dreams and movies, but James talked about it like it was simply the natural result of intelligence and hard work. "Tell me about the settlement," she said, settling more comfortably against him. "Will Victoria fight for half your assets?" "She can try," James replied with confidence, "but I had an airtight prenup drafted by the best family law attorneys in California. Victoria signed it without even reading it thoroughly, if I remember correctly. She was so eager to marry me, so convinced that love would conquer all." Something about his tone made Amber look up at him sharply. There was a coldness there she'd never heard before, a dismissive cruelty that seemed at odds with the charming, attentive lover she knew. "You did love her, though, didn't you? At least in the beginning?" "I thought I did, but looking back, I think I was just attracted to her simplicity. She was so different from the women I usually dated, so uncomplicated and genuine. It was refreshing for a while. And now? Now I realize I need someone who can match my energy, someone who wants to build something extraordinary together." Victoria wanted to hide from the world, to pretend we were just ordinary people living ordinary lives. "But I'm not ordinary, Amber. Neither are you." She kissed him then, tasting ambition and possibility on his lips. Outside her windows, Los Angeles sprawled in all directions, a city of dreams and second chances and reinvention. She'd been born Amanda Kowalski in a town where the biggest excitement was the annual Corn Festival. But she'd remade herself into Amber Delacroix, actress and soon-to-be wife of a millionaire. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. "I love you too," he replied, "and I'm going to give you everything you've ever wanted." Meanwhile, across town, Victoria Sterling sat in Dr. Patricia Williams's office, trying to focus on the steady rhythm of her baby's heartbeat, filling the room through the ultrasound speaker. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Williams said, her kind face creased with concern. "But I'm worried about your stress levels, Victoria. Divorce proceedings can be incredibly difficult, especially this late in pregnancy." "I'll be fine, Dr. Williams. Actually, I think I'm going to be better than fine. I know this situation with your husband must be devastating, but you have a support system, right? Family who can help you through this?" Victoria smiled for the first time in days, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "Yes, Dr. Williams, I have family. More family than James Morrison could ever imagine." Dr. Williams printed out ultrasound photos, and Victoria tucked them carefully into her purse next to her phone. She had calls to make, plans to set in motion, a legacy to reclaim that she'd spent 7 years trying to forget. James Morrison thought he was divorcing a helpless pregnant woman with no resources and no options. But he was about to discover that Victoria Sterling had been hiding more than just her hurt feelings and morning sickness. She'd been hiding an empire. The Sterling family estate in Pittsburgh's Shadyside district had been built in 1892 by Victoria's great-great-grandfather, a Scottish immigrant who'd turned a single furnace into America's third-largest steel empire. The mansion's Gothic revival towers and limestone facade had witnessed 5 generations of Sterling triumphs and tragedies, but none quite like what was about to unfold. Margaret Sterling stood at the library's tall windows, watching the rain streak down glass that had been installed before the First World War. At 62, she retained the commanding presence that had made her the first woman to successfully run a major American steel company. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore a charcoal wool suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Behind her, the library's mahogany shelves held first editions and family photographs spanning more than a century. The largest portrait showed Thomas Sterling, Margaret's late husband and Victoria's grandfather, standing beside the original Sterling steel blast furnace in 1958. "Mrs. Sterling, your granddaughter has arrived," Patricia, her longtime secretary, announced from the doorway. Margaret turned as Victoria entered the library, and for a moment, neither woman spoke. 7 years had passed since Victoria had stormed out of this very room, declaring she was done with the family business, done with the pressure and expectations, done with being a Sterling. Now she stood there 8 months pregnant, her auburn hair longer than Margaret remembered, wearing a simple black dress that couldn't hide either her condition or the quiet steel in her green eyes. "Victoria Catherine Sterling," Margaret said finally, "you look tired." "I am tired, grandmother. Tired of pretending to be someone I'm not." "And who have you been pretending to be?" "A nobody. A woman with no family, no history, no power." Victoria's voice was steady, but Margaret could hear the pain underneath. "I thought if I could just be ordinary, I might find someone who loved me for myself. Turns out ordinary women get discarded just as easily as heiresses." Margaret gestured to the leather armchairs arranged near the fireplace. "Sit down, child. Tell me about James Morrison." Victoria eased herself into her grandfather's favorite chair, the same one where he'd taught her to read financial reports when she was 8 years old. "He's exactly what you'd expect. Ambitious, ruthless, utterly convinced of his own superiority. He built Morrison Innovations from nothing, and now it's worth $40 million. $40 million! Margaret's tone suggested she was discussing pocket change. "How quaint. Grandmother, he served me with divorce papers this morning, while I'm 8 months pregnant with his child." "I see. And this surprises you?" Victoria felt a flash of the old anger. "Yes, it surprises me. I know you never approved of my marriage, but I thought James loved me. I thought I'd found someone who wanted to build a life with me, not just acquire me like another business asset." Margaret moved to the antique sidebar and poured 2 glasses of mineral water, adding lemon slices with precise movements. "Victoria, when you left here 7 years ago, you said the Sterling name was a curse. You said you wanted nothing to do with our family's legacy. I was 22 and idealistic. You were 22 and naive." Margaret handed her the water and settled into the opposite chair. "You thought you could escape who you are, what you represent. But the Sterling name isn't just about money, Victoria. It's about power, influence, and responsibility. It's about understanding that in this world, people like James Morrison are predators, and people like you are either prey or predators themselves." Victoria sipped her water, feeling the baby shift against her ribs. "So what are you suggesting? That I use the family money to destroy him?" "I'm suggesting you remember who you are." Margaret reached for a leather folder on the side table. "Do you know what Sterling Steel's current annual revenue is?" "I've been gone for 7 years, grandmother. I have no idea." $8.7 billion. We control 30% of American steel production, own manufacturing facilities in 12 states, and employ over 40,000 people. Margaret opened the folder and spread financial documents across the coffee table. "We also own significant stakes in 3 major investment firms, 2 shipping companies, and a rather impressive collection of real estate from coast to coast." Victoria stared at the numbers, her mind struggling to process the scale. When she'd left Pittsburgh, Sterling Steel had been successful, but regional. These figures represented something entirely different. "How?" "Your grandfather might have built this company, but I've spent the last 20 years expanding it. While you've been playing house in California, I've been building an empire." Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. "Did you really think I'd let Thomas's legacy stagnate? But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't anyone tell me how big the company had become? Because you made it very clear you wanted nothing to do with us. You changed your phone number, returned our letters unopened, refused to take my calls." Margaret's voice softened slightly. "I respected your wishes, Victoria, but I never stopped hoping you'd come home." Victoria felt tears threaten, and she blinked them back fiercely. "I was so angry. At you. At grandfather's expectations. At the whole world assuming I'd just step into a role I never chose. And now? Victoria looked down at her belly, where her baby was kicking, as if responding to the conversation. Now I have someone else to think about. Someone who deserves better than watching their mother get discarded like yesterday's newspaper. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes intense. Victoria, I need to tell you something. Something that might change your perspective on your husband's divorce filing. What do you mean? Sterling Steel has been quietly acquiring shares in Morrison Innovations for the past 2 years. Through shell companies, investment funds, holding corporations, nothing traceable to our family name. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. How much? 41%. We are, technically speaking, the majority shareholder in your husband's company. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at her grandmother, understanding flooding through her like ice water. You knew. You knew about James's affair, about the divorce, about everything. I knew James Morrison was the kind of man who would eventually show his true colors. I've been preparing for this moment for 2 years, Victoria. The moment when you'd need the sterling name to protect yourself and your child. But how did you know about Amber? About the divorce papers? Margaret smiled the way a chess master smiles when declaring checkmate. Darling, do you really think I'd let my only granddaughter marry someone without having them thoroughly investigated? I've had private investigators monitoring James Morrison since the day you announced your engagement. Victoria felt the world tilt beneath her, everything she thought she knew rearranging itself into new and terrifying patterns. You've been watching us for 5 years. I've been protecting you. There's a difference. Margaret gathered the financial documents back into their folder. James Morrison thinks he's divorcing a helpless pregnant woman. He has no idea he just declared war on a family that's been fighting and winning battles since before his great-grandparents were born. What do you want me to do? I want you to come home, Victoria. Really home. I want you to take your place as my heir and the future head of Sterling Steel. Margaret's voice was firm but gentle. And I want you to show James Morrison exactly what happens when someone underestimates a sterling woman. Victoria stood carefully, her hand on her lower back. Through the library's tall windows, she could see the lights of Pittsburgh beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. This city had built empires and broken them, had forged the steel that built America's skyscrapers and bridges. I need to make some phone calls, she said finally. Of course. Patricia has prepared the rose suite for you, and Dr. Elizabeth Chen from Presbyterian Hospital will be here in the morning to check on you and the baby. Victoria paused at the library door. Grandmother, when you say James has no idea who he declared war on, what exactly do you mean? Margaret Sterling's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I mean, my dear girl, that tomorrow morning, James Morrison is going to discover his wife isn't the nobody he thought he married. And by the time we're finished, he's going to wish he'd shown you the respect you deserved. As Victoria climbed the mansion's curved staircase to her childhood bedroom, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 7 years. The weight and power of her family name settling around her shoulders like armor. James Morrison had made the mistake of his life. He just didn't know it yet. Victoria returned to the Beverly Hills house she'd shared with James, knowing it would be for the last time. The morning sun slanted through windows she'd once thought of as home, but now the space felt like a stage set for someone else's life. James was in the master bedroom, methodically packing his Italian suits into leather suitcases. He'd always been precise in everything he did, and even his departure was executed with corporate efficiency. You're back early, he said without looking up. I thought you'd want to avoid this part. I needed to get a few things. Victoria moved to her dresser, pulling out items she'd need for her stay in Pittsburgh. When will you be finished here? This afternoon, I'm taking most of my clothes and personal effects. Obviously, the house will need to be sold as part of the settlement, so you'll want to start thinking about where you'd like to live after the baby comes. The casual way he discussed dismantling their life together made Victoria's chest tighten, but she kept her voice steady. I've already made arrangements. Good. I'm glad you're being practical about this. James folded a shirt with the same care he used for everything, creasing the sleeves just so. My attorney will be in touch about scheduling a settlement conference. I think you'll find I'm being very generous considering. Considering what? Considering you brought nothing to this marriage except yourself. The words were delivered without malice, as simple statement of fact in James's mind. I've built everything we have, Victoria. The house, the cars, the lifestyle. You've been along for the ride. Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she kept packing. I see. I'm not trying to be cruel, but we both know the reality here. You have no income, no assets of your own, no family money to fall back on. That prenup you signed protects both of us from making unrealistic demands. He moved to his nightstand, collecting expensive watches and cufflinks. Victoria watched him pack away the Rolex she'd given him for their first anniversary, the one she'd saved for 6 months to afford by selling jewelry her grandmother had given her as a teenager. James, can I ask you something? Of course. When did you know? When did you know our marriage was over? He paused, a platinum watch halfway to his suitcase. Honestly, about a year ago, maybe longer. You started talking about wanting to have children, wanting to slow down, wanting me to spend more time at home. It became clear we wanted fundamentally different things. So you decided to find someone who wanted the same things you wanted. I decided to be honest about who I am instead of pretending to be someone I'm not. James's tone suggested he viewed this as admirable self-awareness. Amber understands my ambitions. She wants to build something extraordinary together, not retreat into domestic mediocrity. The doorbell rang and Victoria heard familiar footsteps in the foyer. Rebecca Hayes appeared in the bedroom doorway, her expression stormy. James Morrison, you are a piece of work, Rebecca announced without preamble. She was Victoria's age but carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her worth. Dark-haired and fierce-eyed, she'd been Victoria's closest friend since college. Rebecca, this is a private conversation, James replied coolly. Not anymore, it isn't. Rebecca crossed her arms and fixed him with a stare that had withered corporate executives and Hollywood agents alike. I just wanted to see for myself what a man looks like when he serves divorce papers to his 8 months pregnant wife. This situation is more complicated than you understand. Oh, I understand perfectly. You found a younger woman who strokes your ego better, and you decided to trade up. The fact that your wife is about to give birth to your child is just an inconvenient detail. James closed his suitcase with sharp clicks. Victoria and I have grown apart. It happens in marriages. We're handling this as maturely as possible. Maturely? Rebecca's voice climbed an octave. You're abandoning a pregnant woman for an actress half your age? There's nothing mature about that, James. That's just selfishness with expensive lawyers. Victoria watched the exchange with growing fascination. For 5 years, she'd tried to keep peace between her husband and best friend, softening Rebecca's sharp edges and excusing James's coldness. Now she wondered why she'd bothered. Rebecca, it's okay, she said quietly. James has made his choice. We all have to live with the consequences. No, it's not okay, Vic. You don't just get to... Rebecca stopped mid-sentence, studying Victoria's face. Wait, something's different. You look different. I'm 8 months pregnant and getting divorced. Of course I look different. No, this is something else. Rebecca tilted her head, the way she did when working out a complex problem for her marketing firm. You look, I don't know, stronger somehow. James hefted his suitcases and headed for the door. I'll be at the Chateau Marmont if you need to reach me about anything urgent. Otherwise, all communication should go through my attorney. After he left, Rebecca helped Victoria pack maternity clothes and personal items into her own suitcase. Okay, spill. Where are you going, and why do you look like you just remembered something important? Victoria sat on the edge of the bed they'd shared for 3 years, her hands resting on her belly. Rebecca, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you years ago. What? My name isn't really Victoria Sterling Morrison. It's Victoria Catherine Sterling. I don't understand the distinction. Victoria took a deep breath. Sterling Steel Industries. Have you heard of it? The steel company? Yeah, they're huge. They sponsor the Pittsburgh Symphony, have their name on half the buildings downtown. Rebecca's eyes widened. Wait, Sterling. Your maiden name is Sterling. My grandfather was Thomas Sterling. He built Sterling Steel from nothing, turned it into one of America's largest manufacturing companies. My grandmother Margaret has been running it since he died 15 years ago. Rebecca stared at her for a long moment. You're telling me you're rich? I'm telling you my family's rich. Extremely rich. $8.7 billion in annual revenue rich. Jesus Christ, Victoria. 8 billion? Rebecca sank into the bedroom's upholstered chair. And you never told me? In 10 years of friendship, you never mentioned that your family owns a Fortune 500 company? I ran away from all that when I was 22. I wanted to make my own way, find someone who loved me for myself, not for my family's money. So you lied to James about your background. I omitted the truth. I told him my family was in business, that we were estranged, that I didn't want to talk about it. He never pushed for details. Rebecca was quiet for several minutes, processing the revelation. Finally, she looked up with the expression Victoria couldn't read. He has no idea, does he? James has no idea who he's divorcing? None whatsoever. Holy shit, Vic! Holy shit! Rebecca started laughing, a sound caught between hysteria and pure joy. He thinks he's getting rid of some helpless housewife, and instead he's about to go to war with an industrial dynasty. Victoria smiled for the first time in days. Something like that. What are you going to do? I'm going home to Pittsburgh. I'm going to have my baby surrounded by family who actually want us both. And I'm going to show James Morrison exactly what happens when someone underestimates a sterling woman. Rebecca stood up abruptly. I'm coming with you. Rebecca, you can't just... The hell I can't. You're about to wage corporate warfare against your narcissistic ex-husband, and you think I'm missing that? I've waited 10 years to see someone put James Morrison in his place. Victoria felt tears threaten, but these were different from the tears she'd shed that morning. These were tears of gratitude and relief, and something that felt remarkably like hope. He married a nobody, she said softly, echoing her grandmother's words. But he's divorcing a sterling. As they finished packing, Victoria caught sight of herself in the bedroom mirror. Rebecca was right. Something had changed in her face. The uncertainty and self-doubt she'd carried for 7 years were gone, replaced by something sharper and more purposeful. James Morrison thought he'd discarded a liability. Instead, he'd awakened a dynasty. Sterling Steel Industries' headquarters occupied 4 blocks of downtown Pittsburgh, a gleaming testament to American industrial might. The original 1920s structure had been expanded over the decades, but Margaret Sterling had insisted on preserving the Art Deco lobby with its soaring ceilings and murals depicting the heroic age of steel production. Victoria stood in that lobby for the first time in 7 years, feeling the weight of history and expectation settling around her shoulders. Employees hurried past, some doing double takes when they recognized her face from old company newsletters and family photographs that still hung in the executive corridors. Miss Sterling? A young woman in an impeccably tailored suit approached with obvious nervousness. I'm Jennifer Walsh, Mrs. Sterling's new assistant. She's waiting for you in the boardroom. The elevator ride to the 50th floor felt both eternal and instantaneous. Victoria's reflection stared back at her from the polished steel doors, and she hardly recognized herself. Gone was the uncertain young woman who'd fled Pittsburgh 7 years ago. In her place stood someone who looked capable of commanding respect and inspiring fear in equal measure. The executive boardroom hadn't changed since Victoria's childhood. The same massive mahogany table, the same leather chairs, the same oil paintings of sterling patriarchs watching over modern corporate battles. But now there were additions. Framed photographs of Margaret receiving industry awards, groundbreaking ceremonies for new facilities, handshake deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Margaret Sterling sat at the head of the table, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed documents. David Harrison, the family attorney, occupied the chair to her right, surrounded by legal briefs and files that probably contained enough information to destroy or create fortunes. Victoria, Margaret said without looking up. Perfect timing. David was just explaining Morrison Innovations' current financial position. David Harrison had been the Sterling family attorney for 20 years, a soft-spoken man whose mild appearance disguised one of the sharpest legal minds in Pennsylvania. He'd guided the family through hostile takeover attempts, environmental lawsuits, and labor disputes with the same calm competence. Victoria, congratulations on your marriage, he said with gentle irony, though I suspect the congratulations might be premature. What have you found, David? He opened the folder in front of him. Morrison Innovations is impressive for a company James built from nothing, But it's also highly vulnerable. 70% of their revenue comes from three major contracts, all of which are up for renewal in the next 18 months. Their debt-to-equity ratio suggests they've been growing faster than their cash flow can support. And most interesting of all, James has been using company funds to finance his rather expensive lifestyle. Victoria felt a flutter of uncertainty. Is that illegal? Not necessarily if it's properly documented as executive compensation or legitimate business expenses. But James has been creative in his bookkeeping. The private jet trips with Miss Delacroix were written off as business development. The jewelry purchases were classified as client gifts. The hotel suites were listed as temporary corporate housing. Margaret looked up from her documents. In other words, your husband has been treating his company like a personal piggy bank, which makes our position considerably stronger. I don't understand. David leaned forward. Victoria, when you signed that prenup, you were presumably acting as Victoria Sterling, private citizen with modest assets. But Victoria Sterling, heiress to the Sterling Steel fortune, never consented to anything. The prenup is based on fraudulent representation of your financial position. The implications hit Victoria like a physical blow. You mean the prenup isn't valid? More than that, Margaret said, setting down her reading glasses. It means James entered into a marriage contract under false pretenses. He believed he was marrying someone with no significant assets or family connections. The prenup was designed to protect his wealth from a gold digger. Instead, he married someone whose family could buy his entire company with petty cash. Victoria sank into one of the leather chairs, her mind racing. But I chose not to tell him about my background. Doesn't that make me equally responsible? Legally. No, David replied. You're not required to disclose family wealth before marriage unless specifically asked. James never investigated your background thoroughly enough to discover your family connections. That's his oversight, not your deception. Besides which, Margaret added with satisfaction, we've discovered some rather interesting details about James's relationship with Miss Delacroix. It appears their affair began shortly after your first anniversary, not 3 months ago as he claimed. Victoria felt something twist in her chest. How do you know? Hotel records, credit card statements, text message logs. James has been remarkably careless about covering his tracks. Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut. I believe the appropriate legal term is adultery with financial dissipation of marital assets. David nodded. In California, that significantly impacts divorce settlements. James used community property to fund his affair, which gives you grounds to seek reimbursement plus punitive damages. Victoria looked around the boardroom at the portraits of her ancestors who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars and countless corporate battles. She thought about James's casual cruelty that morning, his assumption that she had no resources or options. What about Morrison Innovations? You said we own 41%? Through various shell companies and investment funds, yes. James has no idea his majority shareholder is his estranged wife's grandmother. Margaret gathered her documents. Which brings us to our next decision point, Victoria. What exactly do you want to accomplish here? I want my child to be provided for. I want James to understand that actions have consequences, and I want him to know exactly who he underestimated. Revenge, in other words. Victoria considered the word. Justice. I want justice. Margaret stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Pittsburgh and the 3 rivers that had built the city's fortune. Victoria, there are several ways we can proceed. We can expose James's financial irregularities and force Morrison Innovations into bankruptcy. We can use our stock position to remove him as CEO and install our own management team. We can drag him through years of expensive litigation that will cost him everything he's built. Or we can offer him a chance to exit gracefully, buy out his remaining shares at fair market value, allow him to save face, give him enough money to start over somewhere else. Margaret turned back to face her granddaughter. The choice is yours, Victoria. But remember, whatever we do will affect your child as well. James Morrison may be a faithless husband, but he is still your baby's father. Victoria felt her baby kick against her ribs, as if responding to the mention of its father. She thought about the life she'd planned, the suburban dream she'd been willing to sacrifice her family legacy to achieve. None of it had been real. James had never loved her the way she loved him, but she could make sure their child never suffered for their parents' mistakes. "I want him to know," she said finally. "I want James to understand exactly who he married and what he's lost. But I don't want to destroy him. I want him to choose his own fate." Margaret's smile suggested she'd expected exactly that answer. "David, prepare an offer to purchase James Morrison's remaining shares in Morrison Innovations. Fair market value, no penalties. Clean exit. And if he refuses, then we'll show Mr. Morrison what happens when someone declares war on a family that's been winning battles for over a century." As Victoria left Sterling Steel headquarters that afternoon, she felt a strange sense of completion. For 7 years, she'd tried to be someone she wasn't. Now finally, she was coming home to herself. James Morrison had wanted to divorce a nobody. Instead, he was about to negotiate with a dynasty. James Morrison stood in his corner office at Morrison Innovations, staring at the legal document that had just destroyed his carefully ordered world. The letterhead read Blackstone Pearson Associates, one of Pittsburgh's most prestigious corporate law firms, and the content was both impossible and terrifying. "Marcus, read this again," he said to his business partner, who sat across from the mahogany desk looking equally stunned. Marcus Reed had been James's college roommate, best man at his wedding, and the only person who'd believed in Morrison Innovations when it was nothing but an idea sketched on a napkin. At 38, he possessed the steady temperament that balanced James's more volatile ambitions. "It says Sterling Steel Industries is making an offer to purchase Morrison Innovations through a private acquisition," Marcus read slowly. "All outstanding shares, including yours. Fair market value based on third-party assessment." "Sterling Steel," James repeated. "I've never heard of them." "I have." Marcus set down the document and reached for his laptop. "They're huge, James, like Fortune 500 huge. Steel production, manufacturing, industrial construction, based in Pittsburgh. Why would a steel company want to buy a tech firm? Diversification, market expansion. Who knows why billionaires do anything?" Marcus pulled up Sterling Steel's website, and both men stared at the corporate overview. "Jesus Christ, James, look at these numbers. 8.7 billion in annual revenue. Facilities in 12 states. 40,000 employees." James felt something cold settle in his stomach. This has to be a mistake. Why would a company that size even know we exist? "Because someone told them we exist." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "James, this isn't a random acquisition offer. This is targeted, specific, and perfectly timed with your divorce proceedings. Someone with serious money and serious connections wants to buy your company right now." The implications hit James like a physical blow. "You think Victoria's behind this somehow?" "I think Victoria Sterling Morrison has a very interesting maiden name, and I think you might want to Google it before you make any assumptions about your wife's resources." James turned to his computer and typed Victoria Sterling into the search engine. The first result made his hands shake. "Sterling Steel Heiress returns to Pittsburgh after 7-year absence." The accompanying photograph showed Victoria at a charity gala, wearing an elegant black gown, and standing next to an older woman identified as Margaret Sterling, CEO and chairman of Sterling Steel Industries. Victoria looked confident, poised, and completely different from the uncertain pregnant woman he'd served with divorce papers just 2 days ago. "She's the heir to Sterling Steel," he whispered. Marcus leaned over to read the article. "Holy shit, James. Holy shit. You married the granddaughter of Thomas Sterling, the guy who built one of America's largest industrial empires. And you served her with divorce papers while she was 8 months pregnant." James scrolled through more search results, finding articles about Victoria's grandfather, her grandmother's corporate achievements, the Sterling family's philanthropic activities. Every result painted a picture of wealth and power beyond anything he'd ever imagined. How did I not know? How did I not know any of this? Because she didn't tell you, obviously. Jesus, James, think about it. How much do you actually know about Victoria's background? Her family? Where she came from? James tried to remember conversations from their early relationship, but Victoria had always been vague about her family, claiming they were estranged and she didn't want to discuss it. He'd assumed it was typical family drama, nothing more serious than personality conflicts or political disagreements. She said her family was in business, that they didn't get along, that she wanted to make her own way, he said weakly. Her own way, right. She was worth billions of dollars and chose to work as a museum curator, making $40,000 a year. Marcus's voice was incredulous. James, she was hiding from her inheritance, and you never bothered to find out why. James's phone rang, and he saw his attorney's number on the display. Mitchell, please tell me you have some good news. James, we need to talk, immediately. My office, and bring whatever financial documents you have from Morrison Innovations. What's wrong? What's wrong is that your wife just hired David Harrison to represent her in the divorce proceedings. Who's David Harrison? Only the most expensive family law attorney in Pennsylvania. The man corporations call when they're facing existential threats. James, David Harrison's retainer costs more than most people's annual salary. After hanging up, James stared at his computer screen, trying to process the magnitude of his miscalculation. He'd thought he was divorcing a powerless woman with no resources. Instead, he'd declared war on industrial royalty. What are you going to do? Marcus asked. I don't know. Call Victoria, maybe. Try to explain that this was all a misunderstanding? Marcus gave him a look of profound pity. James, you served your 8 months pregnant wife with divorce papers so you could marry a 25-year-old actress. I don't think there's any misunderstanding to clarify. James's assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, her face flushed with excitement. Mr. Morrison, Channel 7 News is downstairs. They want to interview you about your wife. My wife? Victoria Sterling. Apparently, she made some kind of announcement today about returning to the family business. The reporters are calling it, The Prodigal Heiress Returns Home. So what they want to know about your marriage, the divorce, whether you'll be joining Sterling Steel Industries. James felt the world tilt beneath him. Tell them no comment. Tell them we're not available for interviews. After his assistant left, Marcus shook his head slowly. You know what the really crazy part is? If you'd just been a decent husband, you could have been part of one of America's wealthiest families. Instead, you threw it all away for an actress who's probably already planning her exit strategy. James thought about Amber, about her excitement over his $40 million company, about her dreams of becoming a power couple in Los Angeles. $40 million had seemed like an impressive fortune when he was comparing himself to other tech entrepreneurs. Compared to $8.7 billion, it was lunch money. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. James, we should talk. This doesn't have to be a war. Victoria. He stared at the message, remembering the woman he'd married 5 years ago. Quiet, thoughtful Victoria who'd preferred staying home to attending industry parties. Victoria who'd been content with their modest lifestyle, who'd never demanded expensive jewelry or luxury vacations. Victoria who could have bought and sold his entire company without affecting her family's daily cash flow. Marcus, I think I made the biggest mistake of my life. Yeah, James, I think you did too. Outside Morrison Innovations windows, Los Angeles sprawled in all directions, a city built on dreams and ambition and the constant pursuit of more. James had spent 15 years building his company, sacrificing relationships and personal happiness for the pursuit of success. Now he was learning that true power had been sleeping beside him all along, and he'd been too blind and arrogant to recognize it. His phone rang again. This time it was Amber. James, darling, I just saw the news. Is it true? Is Victoria really a billionaire heiress? He looked at the acquisition offer on his desk, at the Google search results still glowing on his computer screen, at the future he'd destroyed with his own hands. Yes, Amber, it's true. The silence on the other end of the line told him everything he needed to know about the woman he'd chosen over his wife. The Sterling Steel executive boardroom had hosted presidents and prime ministers, labor leaders and foreign dignitaries, but Victoria doubted it had ever contained the particular combination of tension, regret, and barely suppressed fury that filled the space now. James Morrison sat across the polished mahogany table from her, flanked by his attorney and looking like a man who'd just discovered he'd been sleepwalking toward a cliff. He'd lost weight in the 3 days since their last conversation, and his expensive suit couldn't hide the exhaustion in his eyes. Victoria occupied the chair that had once belonged to her grandfather, with Margaret Sterling to her right and David Harrison to her left. Behind them, oil paintings of 5 generations of Sterling patriarchs seemed to watch the proceedings with ancient judgment. "Victoria," James said quietly, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "You look well." "Thank you." Her tone was polite but distant, the voice she might use with a business acquaintance. "I understand you received our acquisition offer." Yes, I did." James glanced around the boardroom, taking in the obvious displays of wealth and power. "I have to admit, this isn't what I expected when you said we needed to talk." Margaret Sterling spoke for the first time since the introductions. "Mr. Morrison, what exactly did you expect?" "I expected to meet with Victoria in a coffee shop or a lawyer's office. I expected to discuss custody arrangements and asset division." He looked directly at Victoria. "I didn't expect to discover that my wife is the heir to one of America's largest industrial fortunes." "Your estranged wife," Victoria corrected gently. "And I'm not the heir, James. I'm the heiress. There's a difference." David Harrison opened the file in front of him. "Mr. Morrison, we're prepared to make you a very generous offer. Sterling Steel will purchase your remaining 59% stake in Morrison Innovations at fair market value, based on independent third-party assessment. You'll walk away with enough money to start over anywhere you choose." James's attorney, a nervous man named Mitchell who clearly regretted taking this case, leaned forward. "And if Mr. Morrison declines your offer, then Sterling Steel will exercise its rights as the majority shareholder and restructure Morrison Innovations according to our strategic vision," Margaret replied smoothly, "which may or may not include Mr. Morrison in a leadership capacity." The threat was delivered with such elegant politeness that it took James a moment to fully understand what he'd heard. "You're saying you'll fire me from my own company." "We're saying we'll fire you from our company," Victoria said. "James, Morrison Innovations hasn't been your company for 2 years. Not since my family began acquiring shares through various investment vehicles." "Why?" The word came out raw, stripped of pretense. "Why did you lie to me for 5 years? Why did you hide who you really are?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on her rounded belly where their child moved restlessly. "Because I wanted to be loved for myself, not for my family's money. Because I'd spent 22 years watching people change when they learned my last name. Because I wanted to believe that somewhere in the world was a man who could love plain Victoria Sterling. Not heiress Victoria Sterling. But you never gave me the chance to love all of you. You made that decision for both of us." "Did I?" Victoria's voice remained calm, but James could hear steel underneath. "Tell me, James, if you'd known about my family's wealth when we first met, what would have changed?" "Nothing. Everything would have been exactly the same." "Really? You wouldn't have been more attentive? More romantic? More eager to please?" Victoria leaned forward slightly. "You wouldn't have seen dollar signs instead of the woman you claim to have loved." James opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. The truth was uncomfortable but undeniable. Knowing about Victoria's inheritance would have changed everything about their relationship. His pursuit would have been more aggressive, his commitment more strategic, his entire approach calculated around access to her family's resources. "You see," Margaret said with satisfaction, "my granddaughter understands human nature better than you gave her credit for. But lying to me for 5 years." "I never lied," Victoria interrupted. "I told you my family was in business. I told you we were estranged. I told you I didn't want to discuss it. Everything I said was true." David Harrison spread documents across the table. "Mr. Morrison, we've also discovered some interesting details about your financial management of Morrison Innovations. Company funds used for personal expenses, creative bookkeeping around executive compensation, and what appears to be systematic conversion of business assets to support your lifestyle." James felt his face flush. Those were legitimate business expenses. Private jet trips with Miss Delacroix were business expenses. Jewelry purchases were business expenses. Hotel suites for your extramarital affairs were business expenses. David's voice never rose, but each question landed like a physical blow. "I can explain." "I'm sure you can," Margaret said. "The question is whether those explanations will satisfy the Internal Revenue Service, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the various other regulatory bodies that might be interested in your bookkeeping practices. The silence that followed was deafening. James looked around the boardroom, at the portraits of men who'd built empires through intelligence and ruthlessness, at the woman he'd married and underestimated, at the future he'd destroyed through his own arrogance and infidelity. "Victoria, I need to ask you something," he said quietly. "Did you know? When you married me, did you know your family would eventually buy my company?" Victoria met his gaze steadily. "No, James. My grandmother made those investments without my knowledge, as protection for me and any children I might have. I had no idea Sterling Steel owned part of Morrison Innovations until 3 days ago." "But you called her. After I served you with divorce papers, you called your family for help." "Yes, I did. After 5 years of trying to be the woman you wanted, after 5 years of making myself smaller and quieter and more accommodating, I finally remembered who I really am." Victoria's voice grew stronger. "I called my grandmother because you made it clear that you viewed our marriage as a business transaction. So I decided to treat it like one." James looked at the acquisition documents, at the numbers that represented 15 years of his life's work. The offer was fair, even generous, but accepting it meant acknowledging that everything he'd built could be bought and sold by people who operated on a completely different level of wealth and power. "What happens to Morrison Innovations if I accept your offer?" "It becomes a subsidiary of Sterling Steel Industries," Margaret replied. "We'll maintain the Morrison name and the existing employee structure. Your company will continue to operate exactly as it does now, with better financing and expanded market access. And if I refuse, then you'll discover what happens when someone with $40 million tries to fight someone with $8 billion. Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut. "James, you've been playing checkers while we've been playing chess. You can either accept our generosity or learn exactly how outmatched you are." James's attorney whispered something urgent in his ear, and James nodded slowly. "I need time to consider your offer." "Of course," Victoria said. "Take all the time you need." "But James." "Yes?" "Our baby is due in 3 weeks. I'd prefer to have this settled before then, so I can focus on more important things than cleaning up the mess you've made of our lives." As James and his attorney gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Victoria felt a strange sense of completion. For 5 years, she'd tried to be the woman James wanted. Now, finally, he was seeing the woman she'd always been underneath. "Victoria," he said from the doorway, "for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't see you clearly, and I'm sorry I threw away something that could have been extraordinary." Victoria nodded acknowledgement but didn't respond. Some apologies came too late to matter, and some mistakes were too fundamental to forgive. After James left, Margaret turned to her granddaughter with obvious pride. "Well played, my dear. Very well played indeed." Victoria looked out the boardroom windows at Pittsburgh's skyline, at the city that had forged her family's fortune. "Grandmother, do you think I'm being too hard on him?" "My dear girl, you're being exactly hard enough. James Morrison made his choices, and now he's living with the consequences." Margaret gathered her papers with brisk efficiency. "The question is, what will you do with your freedom?" Victoria smiled, feeling her baby move against her ribs as if eager to join the conversation. "I think I'll build something extraordinary, something that will make both you and grandfather proud." "You already have," Margaret replied. "You already have." Amber Delacroix sat in her Beverly Hills apartment, staring at her laptop screen with growing horror. The Google search results for Victoria Sterling seemed to multiply every time she refreshed the page, each new article more devastating than the last. Steel Heiress returns to Pittsburgh after 7-year estrangement. Victoria Sterling assumes executive role at family's industrial empire. The prodigal daughter, how a museum curator became a billionaire overnight. Her phone had been ringing constantly for 2 hours, but she'd stopped answering after the third call from Entertainment Weekly, wanting to discuss her relationship with the husband of the Sterling Steel heiress. The terms of her suddenly transformed situation were becoming horrifyingly clear. She'd positioned herself as the other woman in a scandal involving one of America's wealthiest families. James arrived at 6:30, looking haggard and 20 years older than his 36 years. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his tie loosened, his expression that of a man who'd been hit repeatedly with unexpected truths. "You look terrible," Amber said, pouring herself a large glass of wine despite the early hour. "I feel terrible." James collapsed onto her white leather sofa, the same one where they'd celebrated Victoria's ignorance just 3 days ago. "Amber, we need to talk. About the fact that your wife could buy and sell both of us without affecting her daily cash flow?" "Yes, James, I think we do need to talk." He looked up sharply. "How much do you know?" "I know that Victoria Sterling is the granddaughter of Thomas Sterling, the man who built Sterling Steel Industries into an $8 billion empire. I know that her grandmother Margaret is one of the most powerful women in American industry. I know that your wife has been living like a middle-class housewife while sitting on a fortune that makes your tech company look like a lemonade stand." James winced at her blunt assessment. "It's more complicated than that." "Is it?" Amber set down her wineglass with deliberate care. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty simple. You left a billionaire heiress for an actress with a net worth of maybe $50,000. Even I can do that math, James." "Amber, listen to me. Victoria lied about her background for our entire marriage. She never told me about her family's wealth. How was I supposed to know?" "Did you ask?" "What?" "Did you ever ask Victoria about her family's financial situation? Did you ever wonder why a woman with a master's degree from an Ivy League university was content to work as a museum curator for $40,000 a year?" Amber's voice was climbing toward hysteria. "Did you ever think it was strange that she never seemed worried about money, never asked you for expensive gifts, never seemed impressed by your wealth?" James was quiet for a long moment. "No, I thought she was just different, more genuine than other women I'd dated." "More genuine, right." Amber began pacing her living room, her silk dress flowing around her like liquid gold. "James, do you have any idea what this means for my career? For my reputation?" "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm now famous as the woman who broke up the marriage of one of America's wealthiest heiresses. I'm the gold digger who stole a pregnant billionaire's husband." She laughed bitterly. "Do you know what Hollywood does to women who get labeled as homewreckers, especially homewreckers who target pregnant women?" James looked genuinely confused. "But you're beautiful, talented, ambitious. This doesn't change any of that." "James, you sweet, deluded man, this changes everything." Amber stopped pacing and fixed him with a stare. 3 days ago, I was dating a successful tech entrepreneur worth $40 million. It was a good story, a romantic narrative about two ambitious people building something together. Now I'm the actress who destroyed a fairy tale marriage for money that turned out to be pocket change compared to what the wife had. The implications of her words seemed to hit James like cold water. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that continuing this relationship would be career suicide for me, and probably financial suicide for you." Amber's phone rang, and she glanced at the caller ID. "It's my agent, third time in the last hour." She answered on the fourth ring. "Richard, I know what you're going to say." "Amber, honey, we need to do damage control immediately. The tabloids are calling you the woman who came between America's industrial royalty. This is not the kind of publicity that leads to starring roles." "I understand." "Do you? Because I've already had 3 casting directors call to ask if you're available for other woman roles. Supporting parts, Amber. Mistress number 2, secretary who seduces the boss, revenge girlfriend. That's what this scandal is doing to your brand." After hanging up, Amber looked at James with something approaching pity. "My agent wants me to issue a statement distancing myself from you and expressing regret for any pain caused to Victoria and her unborn child." "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. James, I came to Los Angeles with nothing but ambition and a Greyhound bus ticket. I've spent 7 years building a career, making connections, positioning myself for bigger opportunities. I won't let your midlife crisis destroy everything I've worked for." James stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "So that's it? You're just abandoning me?" "I'm protecting myself, the same way you were protecting yourself when you served divorce papers to your pregnant wife." Amber's voice was calm now, businesslike. "James, you made a calculation that Victoria was worth less than your freedom. I'm making a calculation that you're worth less than my career. But I love you. I threw away my marriage for you. You threw away your marriage for the idea of me, for a younger woman who made you feel powerful and desired. Amber moved to her bar and poured another glass of wine, her movements graceful despite her emotional turmoil. But I never loved you, James. I loved what I thought you represented. Success, security, access to a world I couldn't enter on my own. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. You never loved me? I loved the lifestyle. I loved the expensive restaurants and the private jet trips and the jewelry. I loved feeling like I was dating someone important. Amber's honesty was brutal in its precision. But love you? The man who could abandon his pregnant wife for a younger woman? No, James. I never loved that man. James sank back onto the sofa, his head in his hands. So I've lost everything. My marriage, my company, and now you. You haven't lost your company yet. Victoria's family made you a generous buyout offer. How do you know about that? Because I called Victoria this afternoon. James looked up sharply. You what? I called your wife and asked for a meeting. We had coffee at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Amber's smile was sharp and calculating. Lovely woman, by the way. Much classier than I expected. What did you tell her? I told her the truth, that I seduced you because I thought you were wealthy and powerful, and that I'm deeply sorry for the pain I've caused her and her unborn child. Amber finished her wine in one long swallow. And then Victoria Sterling made me an offer I couldn't refuse. What kind of offer? The kind that changes everything, James. The kind that makes me realize just how small time we've both been. Before James could respond, Amber's doorbell rang. She checked her phone and smiled with genuine warmth for the first time in days. That would be my ride to the airport. I have a meeting in Pittsburgh tomorrow morning. Pittsburgh? What's in Pittsburgh? My future, Amber replied, gathering her purse and coat. Victoria offered me something you never could, James. She offered me a chance to be part of something bigger than myself. James watched in stunned silence as the woman he'd sacrificed his marriage for walked toward the door. Amber, wait. We can work this out. We can figure out a way to... No, we can't. She paused at the door, looking back at him with something that might have been compassion. James, you're about to learn something important about power. Real power isn't about having $40 million. Real power is about having $8 billion and the wisdom to use it strategically. What did Victoria offer you? Amber's smile was radiant with possibility. She offered me a starring role in Sterling Steel's new media division, a chance to produce and develop content that actually matters, with unlimited financing and complete creative control. She opened the door, cool evening air rushing into the apartment. She offered me everything I ever wanted, James, and all I had to do was walk away from you. After Amber left, James sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by the elegant furnishings and expensive artwork that had once seemed like symbols of their shared success. Now they felt like props in a play that had ended badly for everyone, except the woman he'd underestimated. His phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. The offer stands until Friday, James. After that, we proceed with the alternative approach. Choose wisely. James looked around the empty apartment, at the life he'd thought he wanted, at the future that was dissolving like sugar in rain. In 3 days, he'd lost his wife, his unborn child, his company's independence, and the woman he'd sacrificed everything to possess. Victoria Sterling had been right about one thing. Actions had consequences. He was finally learning what his consequences looked like. The conference room at Mitchell, Stevens & Associates felt claustrophobic compared to the Sterling Steel boardroom, but it was neutral territory for what James Morrison's attorney hoped would be final negotiations. James sat across from Victoria, noting how different she looked from the uncertain woman he'd served with divorce papers just 1 week ago. Victoria wore a navy suit that probably cost more than most cars, her auburn hair pulled back in an elegant chignon that emphasized her strong jaw and intelligent green eyes. 8 months pregnant, she still managed to project an aura of contained power that made everyone in the room unconsciously straighten their posture. David Harrison sat to her right, surrounded by legal documents and wearing the satisfied expression of a chess player who'd seen checkmate coming 20 moves ago. James's attorney, Mitchell, looked like a man who deeply regretted taking this case. Mr. Morrison, David began, has had adequate time to consider our acquisition offer. We're here to finalize the terms and execute the necessary documents. James cleared his throat. Actually, I've decided to reject your offer. The silence that followed was profound. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the room's atmosphere, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I see, she said quietly. May I ask why? Because Morrison Innovations is my life's work. 15 years of 18-hour days, of sacrificing everything for a vision that nobody else believed in. James's voice gained strength as he spoke. I won't just hand it over to people who want to absorb it into their empire. Mitchell looked nervous. James, perhaps we should discuss... No, James held up a hand. I've thought about this carefully. I'm willing to go to court, to fight for my company, even if it means years of litigation. Victoria exchanged a glance with David Harrison, and James caught something that looked almost like pity in her expression. James, she said gently, I was hoping we could resolve this amicably, for our child's sake. But if you insist on a fight, we'll give you one. What do you mean? David opened a thick folder and spread documents across the table. Mr. Morrison, we've completed a comprehensive audit of Morrison Innovations' financial practices. The results are quite interesting. James felt his stomach clench. What kind of audit? The kind that reveals systematic misappropriation of corporate funds for personal use. The kind that documents fraudulent expense reporting and potential tax evasion. David's voice was clinical, professional. The kind that typically results in federal investigations and criminal charges. Mitchell leaned forward urgently. Now wait just a minute. We have hotel receipts for weekend trips with Miss Delacroix, charged to Morrison Innovations as business development. We have jewelry purchases totaling $60,000, listed as client gifts despite no corresponding client records. We have private jet usage for personal vacations, written off as executive travel. David continued methodically. Shall I continue? James felt the color drain from his face. Those were legitimate business expenses. Were they? Can you provide documentation showing how your romantic weekend in Cabo Del Lucas with Miss Delacroix benefited Morrison Innovations? Can you explain why client gifts of expensive jewelry were never given to actual clients? The room fell silent except for the sound of James's increasingly rapid breathing. But that's not all, Victoria said softly. James, we also know about the falsified earnings reports you submitted to potential investors, the inflated user numbers you provided to venture capital firms, the contracts you claim to have secured that don't actually exist. James's world began to spin. How could you possibly know? Because we've been monitoring your company for 2 years, remember? We know everything, James. Every lie, every deception, every corner you've cut to make Morrison Innovations appear more successful than it actually is. Mitchell was frantically scribbling notes, sweat beading on his forehead. James, we need to discuss a plea arrangement. It gets worse, David continued remorselessly. We've discovered that you used Victoria's social security number to apply for a business line of credit without her knowledge. That's identity theft, Mr. Morrison, a federal felony. James felt something break inside his chest. Victoria, please. We can work this out. I know I made mistakes, but... Mistakes? For the first time, Victoria's composure cracked, revealing the pain and fury underneath. James, you didn't make mistakes. You made calculated decisions to defraud investors, evade taxes, and steal from your own company. All while serving me with divorce papers and planning to marry your mistress. I never meant for any of this. Yes, you did. Victoria's voice was steel wrapped in silk. You meant all of it, James. You meant to discard me when I became inconvenient. You meant to use company funds to support your affair. You meant to lie to investors and creditors and anyone else who stood between you and what you wanted. James looked around the conference room, at the faces staring back at him with various degrees of contempt and professional disappointment. He thought about Amber, flying to Pittsburgh to start her new life funded by sterling steel money. He thought about the reporters who'd been calling, wanting statements about his relationship with America's industrial royalty. He thought about the federal investigations that David Harrison had just casually mentioned. What do you want from me? He asked quietly. We want you to accept reality, Victoria replied. Sign over your shares in Morrison Innovations. Accept our buyout offer. Walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else, preferably far from here. And if I don't, David Harrison smiled with predatory satisfaction. Then we turn our evidence over to the FBI, the IRS, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. You'll spend the next decade fighting criminal charges while your assets are frozen and your reputation is destroyed. Your choice, Mr. Morrison. James felt something collapse inside him, the final surrender of a man who'd overplayed his hand against opponents he'd never understood. How long do I have to decide? Victoria glanced at her watch, a simple Cartier that probably cost more than his car. My water broke 20 minutes ago, James. My contractions are about 5 minutes apart, so you have exactly as long as it takes for my driver to get me to Presbyterian Hospital. The room exploded into motion. Mitchell jumped up, papers scattering. David began efficiently packing documents. Victoria remained seated, her breathing controlled but obviously labored. You're in labor? James asked stupidly. Right now, which means our son is about to be born into whatever world his father creates in the next few minutes. Victoria accepted David's help standing, her movements careful but determined. Choose wisely, James. This is the last decision you'll make that affects both of us. James stared at the woman he'd married 5 years ago, the woman he'd thought he knew completely, the woman who was about to give birth to his child while dismantling his life with surgical precision. Victoria, sign the papers, James. Her voice was gentle now, almost kind. Sign them and walk away. Start over somewhere else. Be the man our son can be proud of, even if you couldn't be the husband I deserved. Another contraction hit, and Victoria gripped David's arm, her breathing becoming shallow and focused. When it passed, she looked at James with something that might have been forgiveness. I loved you, she said simply. I loved you enough to give up everything I was born to be. I loved you enough to hide from my own family for 7 years. I loved you enough to believe that our marriage was worth more than money or power or social position. Victoria, but you didn't love me enough to be faithful. You didn't love me enough to honor your promises. You didn't love me enough to treat me with basic human decency when you decided our marriage was over. She straightened, her voice growing stronger despite the obvious pain. So now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. James picked up the pen Mitchell offered him, his hand trembling. The acquisition documents lay spread across the table, representing 15 years of his life and every dream he'd ever had about building something lasting. If I sign this, what happens to me? You become a wealthy man with no criminal record and a chance to start over, David replied. If you don't sign it, you become a federal defendant with frozen assets and a very uncertain future. James thought about the federal investigations, about prison sentences and financial ruin, about trying to explain to his unborn son why Daddy was in jail. He thought about Amber in Pittsburgh, probably already meeting with Victoria's media division executives, already moving on to bigger and better opportunities. He signed his name with shaking hands. Victoria smiled, the expression transforming her face completely. Thank you, James. Truly, you've just made the best decision you've made in months. Will I be able to see him, our son? Of course. You're his father, and despite everything, I want him to know you. Victoria's smile faded slightly. But James, you'll know him as the son of Victoria Sterling, heiress to the Sterling Steel fortune, not as the son of the woman you thought you married. As David helped Victoria toward the door, she paused and looked back at James one last time. Oh, and James, when you tell people about this someday, about how your marriage ended, remember to tell them the whole truth. Tell them you divorced a billionaire heiress because you thought she wasn't worth your time. The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving James alone with Mitchell and the devastating realization that he'd just signed away everything he'd built for a woman who'd never loved him, while losing a woman who'd loved him enough to hide her true self for 5 years. Outside the conference room windows, Los Angeles sparkled in the afternoon sun, a city of dreams and second chances and reinvention. James Morrison had come to that city 15 years ago with nothing but ambition and a business plan sketched on a napkin. Now he was leaving it with a certified check for $38 million and the knowledge that he'd destroyed the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to him. Some lessons, he thought, cost more than others, and some mistakes couldn't be undone, no matter how much money you had. Thomas James Sterling entered the world at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in September, weighing 7 pounds and 3 ounces, with his mother's green eyes and his father's determined chin. He announced his arrival with a lusty cry that seemed to echo through the private wing of Presbyterian Hospital, as if proclaiming his place in the world from his very first breath. Victoria held her son in the quiet hours before dawn, marveling at his perfect fingers and the way he seemed to study her face with ancient wisdom. Margaret Sterling sat in the bedside chair, her usually composed expression softened by wonder at her first great-grandchild. "He's beautiful, Victoria," Margaret said softly. "Absolutely perfect." "He looks like grandfather," Victoria murmured, tracing her son's tiny features. "The same strong jaw, the same stubborn expression. The same fighting spirit, I suspect." Margaret reached over to stroke the baby's downy hair. "Thomas James Sterling, your grandfather would have been so proud." Rebecca Hayes dozed in the corner chair, having refused to leave despite visiting hour restrictions. She'd been Victoria's labor coach, holding her hand through contractions and offering encouragement through the long night. Even in sleep, she wore a satisfied smile that spoke of battles won and justice served. A soft knock interrupted the peaceful moment. David Harrison entered carrying coffee and wearing the rumpled look of a man who'd spent the night handling legal details. "How are we feeling?" he asked quietly. "Triumphant," Victoria replied, smiling down at her son. "How did James take the final paperwork?" "Better than expected. He signed everything without argument, including the custody agreement and the non-disclosure provisions." David settled into another chair, his voice carefully neutral. He asked if he could visit today to meet his son. Victoria was quiet for a moment, considering. "What do you think, grandmother?" Margaret's expression was unreadable. "I think that decision belongs to you, my dear. You've earned the right to set whatever boundaries feel appropriate." "Yes," Victoria said finally. "He can visit. He's Thomas's father, regardless of what happened between us. But David." "Yes?" "Make sure he understands the terms. He's visiting the son of Victoria Sterling, heiress to Sterling Steel Industries, not the son of the woman he thought he married." David nodded. "I'll make that very clear." Later that morning, as Victoria nursed her son and watched the Pittsburgh skyline through her hospital window, she felt a profound sense of completion. The city where her family had built their fortune stretched out below her, a testament to 5 generations of sterling determination and vision. James arrived at noon, carrying flowers and wearing the expression of a man walking to his own execution. He'd lost weight in the past week, and his expensive clothes couldn't hide the exhaustion in his eyes. "Victoria," he said quietly from the doorway. "Thank you for letting me come." "Of course. Come meet your son." James approached the bed carefully, as if afraid his presence might somehow contaminate the scene. When Victoria placed Thomas in his arms, James's composure cracked completely. "He's incredible," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Absolutely incredible." "His name is Thomas James Sterling," Victoria said gently, "after my grandfather and you." James looked up sharply. "You gave him my name. I gave him part of your name. Because despite everything that's happened between us, you're his father, and I want him to know that." For several minutes, James held his son in silence, memorizing every detail of the tiny face. When Thomas opened his eyes, James caught his breath. "He has your eyes. And your stubborn chin." Victoria's voice was soft but firm. "James, I want you to know that Thomas will always know who his father is. You'll have reasonable visitation rights, input into major decisions about his upbringing, and the chance to build a relationship with him. Even after everything I've done, especially after everything you've done, I want our son to learn from both of our choices, James, the good ones and the mistakes." James carefully returned Thomas to Victoria's arms, his movements reluctant. "I need to tell you something." "What?" "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I threw away something extraordinary because I was too blind and selfish to see what I had." James's voice was barely above a whisper. "But I want you to know that I'm sorry, deeply, profoundly sorry, for every hurt I caused you." Victoria studied his face, seeing genuine remorse there for the first time. "I know you are, James, and I forgive you. How can you forgive me? How can you be so generous when I was so cruel? Because holding on to anger would only hurt our son, and he deserves better from both of us." Victoria adjusted Thomas in her arms, her movements instinctively protective. "Besides, you've given me something I never expected." "What?" "You've given me my life back, my real life, my family, my purpose." Victoria smiled, the expression radiant with new understanding. "If you hadn't served me with those divorce papers, I might never have found the courage to come home to who I really am." James was quiet for a long moment. "What will you do now?" "I'm going to raise our son. I'm going to learn how to run Sterling Steel Industries from the most formidable businesswoman in America. And I'm going to build something extraordinary for the next generation. And personally," Victoria glanced toward the door, where David Harrison was waiting patiently in the hallway, "I think I might have some interesting possibilities to explore." James followed her gaze and nodded slowly. "He's a good man. He's been in love with you for years, hasn't he?" "David has been my friend and protector for a very long time. What happens between us now remains to be seen." A nurse entered to check on Victoria and the baby, and James took it as his cue to leave. At the door, he turned back one more time. "Victoria, when Thomas is old enough to ask about his parents' marriage, what will you tell him?" Victoria considered the question carefully. "I'll tell him that his parents loved each other very much. But sometimes love isn't enough when people want fundamentally different things from life. I'll tell him that his father is a brilliant, ambitious man who built something impressive from nothing. And I'll tell him that his mother learned to be strong enough to choose what was best for both of them." "You won't tell him about my mistakes?" "Thomas will learn about consequences and choices from watching how we both live our lives going forward. Actions speak louder than stories, James." After James left, David entered the room carrying a small velvet box. "Victoria, there's something I need to ask you." "David, we just finalized my divorce yesterday. Don't you think this is rather sudden?" "I've been waiting to ask you this question for 15 years, he replied with a smile. "Ever since you were 14 years old and argued with me about contract law during a family dinner." Victoria laughed, the sound bright and clear. "I was a precocious child. You were a remarkable child who grew into an extraordinary woman." David opened the box, revealing a simple but perfect diamond ring. "Victoria Catherine Sterling, will you marry me?" "Are you asking Victoria Sterling the heiress, or Victoria Sterling the woman?" "I'm asking Victoria Sterling, the person I've loved since she was a teenager, debating legal precedents with lawyers 3 times her age. I'm asking the woman who had the courage to walk away from everything she was born to be, and the wisdom to come home when it mattered most." Victoria looked down at her son, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then at the man who'd stood by her family through every crisis and triumph. "Yes, David, I'll marry you." As David slipped the ring onto her finger, Victoria felt the final pieces of her new life falling into place. She was home, truly home, for the first time in 7 years. She had a son to raise, a legacy to inherit, and a future to build with a man who'd loved her long before he knew about her fortune. 6 months later, Victoria stood in the Sterling Steel boardroom, addressing the company's senior executives about expansion plans for their renewable energy division. Thomas slept in a bassinet beside her chair, occasionally making small sounds that caused the hardened business executives to smile with unexpected tenderness. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see Pittsburgh's skyline, forever changed but still fundamentally the city that had forged American industry. Soon she would marry David in the same cathedral where 5 generations of Sterlings had been wed. She would raise her son to understand both privilege and responsibility, to know that great wealth came with great obligations. James had started a consulting firm in Seattle, using his buyout money to fund sustainable technology initiatives. He visited Thomas once a month, and their relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship. Amber's production company, funded by Sterling Steel's media division, had just won 3 Emmy nominations for a documentary about women in manufacturing. Everyone, it seemed, had found their proper place in the world. That evening, as Victoria tucked Thomas into his crib in the mansion's nursery, she thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. She'd begun as a woman trying to escape her destiny, hiding from her own identity in pursuit of ordinary love. She'd ended as herself, finally and completely herself, with a love that was anything but ordinary. Sweet dreams, little one, she whispered to her son. You're going to change the world someday. I can feel it. Outside the nursery windows, the lights of Pittsburgh twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the distance, the blast furnaces that had built the sterling fortune continued their ancient work of transforming raw materials into something stronger, something lasting, something extraordinary. Victoria Sterling had come home at last, and she was just getting started. If this story of ultimate justice got your blood pumping, smash that like button and let me know in the comments what you thought of Victoria's transformation. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because trust me, you don't want to miss our next tale of karma coming full circle. Share this with anyone who believes that underestimating the quiet ones is always a mistake.